The first thing Dr. Elias Rowan noticed about Kepler-9 was the silence. Not the silence of deep space, which he had grown so accustomed to over the past 11 months that it had stopped registering as anything at all. This was a different kind of silence. Full, weighted, alive. The kind that pressed against your eardrums and made you feel like something was paying very close attention to you. He was standing at the observation deck of the Meridian, hands flat against the cold glass, staring down at a world that looked almost like home. Almost. The oceans were a shade too green. The clouds moved in spirals that felt slightly too deliberate. The continents were small, scattered like broken pieces of ceramic across the equatorial belt. But the atmosphere was breathable. The spectrographic analysis had confirmed it within the first 6 hours of approach. Nitrogen-oxygen mix, trace argon, surface pressure within human tolerance. Biodiversity signatures pointed to a planet roughly 400 million years behind Earth's evolutionary clock. No complex cognition detected, no radio emissions, no artificial structures visible from orbit. It was, in every measurable sense, a miracle. Elias had spent the last decade watching humanity choke on its own exhaust. He'd watched the Antarctic shelf collapse in real time on a monitor in a Houston conference room while administrators argued about liability. He'd testified before 3 different congressional committees about ocean acidification and crop failure projections that seemed too catastrophic to be taken seriously, until, suddenly, they weren't. He was 44 years old and felt at least 60. His daughter had been born into a world that could no longer promise her a future, and that fact lived in him like a splinter he'd stopped trying to remove. So when Project Cradle had been greenlit, 800 scientists, engineers, and selected civilians aboard the most advanced vessel ever constructed, Elias hadn't hesitated. He'd kissed his daughter on the forehead, told her he was going to find her a new home, and walked away without looking back. Because he knew if he looked back, he wouldn't go. 11 months later, he was looking at that new home. "We made it," he whispered, and the words felt fragile and enormous at the same time. The alert tone shattered everything. A single sustained pulse from navigation, the one every crew member had been trained to recognize and had privately prayed they never would. By the time Elias reached the bridge, Commander Darren Voss was already at the central display, his jaw set at the particular angle it took on when he was working very hard to appear calm. "Tell me it's debris," Elias said. "It's not debris." Voss didn't look at him. His eyes were fixed on the radar return blooming at the edge of the display. A vessel, roughly equivalent in mass to the Meridian, decelerating into high orbit on a trajectory that matched their own approach vector almost exactly. It came from the galactic southwest, masked behind the stellar corona. Elias stood very still. "How long have they been watching us?" "Unknown." There was a photograph pinned to the edge of Voss's command console. A boy, maybe 8 years old, gap-toothed grin, holding a fish almost as big as himself on a dock somewhere that looked like the Pacific Northwest. Elias had never asked about it. He'd noticed it on day 1 of the mission and never asked, the way you learn not to ask about certain things aboard a ship where 800 people are sealed together for nearly a year. But right now, watching Voss stare at the alien vessel on the radar, Elias noticed the commander's hand drift briefly to the edge of the console, not touching the photograph, just close to it. "Do we have weapon solutions?" Voss asked the navigator. "Working on it, sir." Elias looked at the planet below and thought about his daughter. He thought about Voss's boy on the dock. He thought about how 2 people could look at the same radar screen and see entirely different problems. The next 48 hours were the longest of Elias's life. Both ships held position at opposing orbital points, maintaining maximum separation while each dispatched automated survey drones to the surface. And then the first data package came back, and Elias understood immediately why this moment was going to define everything. He didn't wait for a presentation. He just pulled up the results, stood over the display in the lab, and watched the numbers arrange themselves into a shape he recognized as doom. The planet's biochemical cycle was exquisitely balanced, but balanced for one. The atmospheric processors in the oceanic phytoplankton, the soil microbiome, the carbon sequestration rates of the native vegetation, all of it operating at nearly perfect efficiency for exactly one biospheric footprint. The models were unambiguous. Full human colonization over 50 years would push the system to 60% of its tolerance threshold. Room for something else, but not something else of equal size. 2 full civilizations and the biochemical equilibrium collapsed somewhere between year 30 and year 40. The same slow-motion catastrophe they'd left behind on Earth, compressed into 4 decades. But the data revealed something else. Something Elias circled and stared at for 4 hours before he trusted it. Human metabolism produced CO2 as its primary atmospheric waste. But based on the spectroscopic signature of the alien vessel's drive exhaust, the chemical ghost it left on its approach trajectory, whatever was aboard that ship metabolized carbon in almost exactly the reverse process. They consumed atmospheric carbon. They produced compounds that, on this particular planet's chemistry, would bind with the native soil in a deeply beneficial way. In isolation, either species would slowly poison the planet. Together, carefully managed, they might actually improve it. Elias stared at that conclusion for a long time. Then he went to Voss and laid out everything. The collapse scenario and the cooperative scenario side by side, the numbers clean and unavoidable. Voss studied the display. His expression didn't change. "So we need to act before they establish surface presence," he said. "That's not what the data says to do. That's what survival says to do, Elias." "Commander." Elias kept his voice level. "If we colonize at full capacity, and they do the same, we have 37 years before this planet becomes uninhabitable, for both of us. If we coordinate, reduce initial population loads, share the biochemical management, the planet stabilizes, we both survive. At 30% of projected capacity. To start." Voss turned away from the display and looked out the viewport at the planet below. When he spoke, his voice was quieter. "We have 800 people on this ship, Elias. We were supposed to seed a colony of 1 million within 2 generations. Earth has 18 months, maybe 24. He paused. "You're asking me to tell the people aboard this ship that we're splitting what they came here for with something we don't even have a word for yet. I'm asking you to look at what happens if we don't." Voss looked at the collapse curve for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll take it under advisement," in a tone that told Elias the conversation was over. The first communication from the other ship came 6 hours later. Not a radio signal, something more elegant. A sequence of prime numbers embedded in modulated gravitational waves, a medium that required genuinely advanced physics to both generate and detect. Elias responded with the next prime in the sequence, then a Fibonacci series, then a periodic table map in binary. It took 9 hours, but contact was made. The translation framework they built together over the following 3 days was primitive but functional. A pidgin language assembled from mathematical structures and spectroscopic references to shared physical constants. The entity on the other end identified herself as Karine. Her title translated to something between evolutionary biologist and species custodian. Her biology was silicon-based, augmented by photonic metabolic processes. She derived energy from specific light frequencies the way plants did, while also consuming mineral compounds. A biology so different from human physiology that the 2 species could not share a food source, could not transmit disease to each other, could not cause each other biological harm simply by existing in proximity. They were biochemically incompatible, and as Elias had already calculated, complementary. Karine had reached the same conclusion. She had run the cooperative model independently and arrived at the same numbers. She wasn't reaching out to negotiate territory. She was reaching out because she'd seen something in the geological survey data that she couldn't explain, and she needed to know if he had seen it too. He hadn't, not yet. He pulled up the geological package and searched for whatever had flagged her attention. And then he found it, and he stopped moving entirely. Buried under 40 meters of volcanic basalt in the northern continent, the survey drones had flagged a geometric anomaly on day 1, classified as interesting and deprioritized, while bigger questions occupied the team. Looking at it now, Elias understood why it had felt too strange to deal with immediately. It was a lattice of crystalline structures arranged in a perfect hexagonal pattern, covering an area the size of Rhode Island, each node connected to every other by filaments of a mineral compound, with no analog in any geological database. not a natural formation. The mathematical precision of its construction made that clear to anyone who looked at it for more than 30 seconds. Someone had built this. He spent 4 hours cross-referencing the lattice data with Karine before they arrived at the same interpretation simultaneously, in different languages, from different sides of the planet. The lattice was functional. It was a network of sensors and processors using the planet's own mineral substrate as computational medium. It had been monitoring everything since their arrival, and it was connected, through mechanisms neither science team fully understood yet, to the planet's core dynamics. Karine sent the threshold model 40 minutes after they identified the lattice. Elias ran it himself independently and got the same answer. If the accumulated stress indicators in the lattice network crossed a certain point, if the monitoring system registered sufficient evidence of interspecies hostility, the thermal dynamics of the planetary core would shift, catastrophically, the kind of catastrophe that would make this planet uninhabitable for 40,000 years. Whoever built this place had built a very specific lesson into its foundation. Get along or get nothing. Elias was still processing the full weight of this when the Meridian's engineering bay called him. One of Voss's contingency protocols was already in motion, a series of targeted electromagnetic pulses designed to disable the alien vessel's orbital maneuvering systems. Strategic positioning, Voss had called it in the orders. Not an attack. An advantage. Elias ran to the bridge. He was halfway there when every screen on the ship flickered simultaneously. Not a power failure. The system stayed up, all of them. But the display across every monitor shifted for exactly 3 seconds to show the same thing. A map of the planet's lattice network, pulsing. Every node lit at once. Then it stopped. And the Meridian's electromagnetic pulse array had somehow already discharged, not into the alien ship's maneuvering systems, but straight down into the planet's upper atmosphere, where it dissipated harmlessly. The targeting had been redirected, not by anyone aboard the Meridian, not by the alien ship, by the planet. Elias stood in the corridor outside the bridge and breathed very carefully for a moment. Then Karine's signal came through, urgent and uncharacteristically blunt in their shared mathematical pidgin. Your ship attempted interference. So did mine. The planet neutralized both. This is not coincidence. We need to talk immediately. They talked. And what emerged from that conversation was the full picture of what this place was. Not terraformed, built, assembled from constituent materials, seated with a precisely engineered biosphere, positioned around exactly the right star, and set to wait. For species advanced enough to arrive. To run tests they didn't know they were taking. The records in the lattice. Karine's team had found an access point in the southern continent. Elias's team found another in the north. Showed others. Other species who had found planets like this one. Some had cooperated, some hadn't. The records of those who hadn't were brief. They ended with the thermal cascade signature. The records of those who had cooperated continued for spans of time that made human history look like a single afternoon. Civilizations that grew from this kind of beginning into things Elias lacked the cognitive framework to fully grasp. He brought all of it to Voss. Every piece of evidence organized into the clearest possible presentation. Voss listened, watched the lattice data, read the threshold analysis, looked at the comparison between the collapse model and the cooperative model one more time. Or it's fabricated, Voss said. The alien ship feeds false data to your survey drones, creates a doomsday scenario to prevent us from acting. Karine's team reached the same conclusions independently. I've verified our data provenance, no evidence of tampering. You trust her? I think she's a scientist who doesn't want her people to die, which puts her in exactly the same position I'm in. Voss was quiet. His hand moved to the edge of the console again, close to the photograph of the boy on the dock, not touching it. Command sent updated orders this morning, he said finally. 6-month-old signal. They sent it when we were halfway here. Didn't know about the alien ship yet, but anticipated the possibility. He paused. If there's another civilization with competing claim to a viable planet, we are authorized and directed to neutralize their colonization capacity by any means necessary. The phrase sat in the air between them like a physical object. Karine received equivalent orders, Elias said. Almost certainly. Then the orders are the problem. Elias held his gaze. They come from people who have everything to lose by sharing, because sharing means reducing their authority, their control, their power over the colony. They made a decision based on a scenario that doesn't actually exist. They don't know about the lattice, they don't know about the biochemical complementarity, they don't know about the threshold. And if we follow those orders, we don't have a colony in 37 years. We have a dead planet. Voss stared at him. What you're describing is mutiny. What I'm describing is choosing survival over obedience. The commander said nothing for a long time, then, "Go back to your lab, I need to think." Elias went back to his lab. He didn't sleep. He was reviewing the lattice access data when the second alert came, not from navigation, not from engineering. From the planet. The seismic monitors lit up across every station simultaneously. Not an earthquake. Something rising. A resonance spreading from the northern lattice node in expanding rings, strong enough to register on the hull sensors. Elias pulled the signature and cross-referenced it with the threshold model. The stress indicators had spiked. Not to the critical threshold, but close. Much closer than they'd been an hour ago. He called Corrine immediately. Her response came back in under 2 minutes. "My commanders have ordered a targeting solution on your ship. They are preparing to fire. The planet knows. Look at your monitors." Elias looked. In the visual feed from the surface camera array, the sky above the northern continent was doing something that had no meteorological explanation. The cloud formations were reorganizing, fast, much faster than any natural weather system, into geometric shapes. Hexagons. Perfect, enormous hexagons of cloud cover stretching across hundreds of kilometers of sky, the pattern matching the lattice structure below the ground exactly, as if the planet was displaying its own architecture back at them. The aurora systems, normally confined to the polar regions, had spread across the entire hemisphere in a curtain of cold, blue-white light. And within that light, Elias zoomed the camera feed and sat back hard in his chair. The aurora was pulsing in a sequence. Not randomly. A sequence. The same prime number series they had used to establish first contact with Corrine. The planet was speaking, and it was not speaking gently. Then gravity hiccuped. There was no other word for it. For approximately 20 seconds, every person aboard the Meridian experienced a fluctuation in gravitational pull, a rolling sensation, objects sliding off surfaces, fluids sloshing in their containers, the deep structural groan of a vessel that had not been designed for variable gravity. It lasted exactly 20 seconds and then stopped, clean, as if a switch had been thrown. 20 seconds was enough. In those 20 seconds, Corrine's commanders had aborted their targeting sequence, not because of a philosophical change of heart, because the fluctuation had physically disrupted the weapon's targeting alignment, throwing the calibration off by a margin that required a full recalibration cycle. The planet had given them time. It was not going to give them much more. Elias was already in motion. He contacted 2 engineers he trusted, both of whom had reviewed his full evidence package over the past 24 hours, and had been waiting, he suspected, for someone to make the call. He told them what he needed. They didn't ask many questions. What followed over the next 6 hours was the most precise, careful, and terrifying work Elias had ever done. He knew the Meridian's architecture the way he knew his own apartment. The quirks and shortcuts, the maintenance corridors, the secondary command nodes that the bridge officers rarely monitored. He rerouted the weapons arrays to continuous atmospheric analysis. He diverted the targeting systems. He locked the primary command terminals into a diagnostic loop that would take a competent engineer about 4 hours to break. On the other ship, Corrine was doing the same. At 0340 ship time, Voss discovered what had happened. He didn't shout. He went very still. He walked from the bridge to the engineering bay where Elias was standing, and he crossed the floor between them in 12 even steps, and when he stopped in front of Elias, his face was the color of cold metal. "You have 1 minute," Voss said, "to explain why I shouldn't have you removed from this mission entirely." "I have less than a minute." Elias kept his voice steady. "You need to look at the threshold monitor." Voss looked. The stress indicators had climbed another 15% in the past 3 hours, still below critical but moving in one direction. Voss turned back to Elias. Something shifted in his face, something slow and tectonic. He moved to the emergency override panel on the wall, the mechanical system, the one that bypassed all digital controls, the analog failsafe that every ship carried for exactly the scenario where the digital systems had been compromised. He lifted the cover. His hand closed around the physical key inside. "This fires the reserve thrusters," Voss said. "Repositions us for a ramming trajectory. Doesn't need the weapons array, doesn't need the targeting system." His voice was completely flat. "You didn't account for this." Elias looked at the key in Voss's hand. He looked at Voss's face. He looked briefly at the photograph on the console across the room. The boy with the fish, the Pacific Northwest dock. A day that had happened years ago and was now the only version of that boy Voss could carry with him. "What's his name?" Elias said. Voss went very still. "Your son in the photograph, what's his name?" A long silence. "Marcus." "Marcus is in the second wave," Elias said. "He's on the Callaway. He launches in 4 months." He watched Voss's face. "If you turn that key, the planet crosses the threshold in 6 hours. The core destabilization is irreversible in 72. By the time Marcus arrives, there's nothing here, no planet, no colony, no future." He paused. "You turn that key, and you kill your son." The engineering bay was absolutely silent. Voss's hand did not move. Elias kept his eyes on him. "I know what you were given this mission to do. I know what it means to believe you're responsible for 800 people's survival. I know what it costs to let go of control when control is all you have left." He let that sit for a moment. "But you came here for Marcus, and Marcus needs you to put that key down." Voss's hand was trembling. Slightly, just slightly. He put the key down. He lowered the cover over the override panel. He turned around and walked to the viewport and stood there looking at the planet. And Elias didn't say anything else because there was nothing else that needed saying. What followed took 3 days. Voss called the crew assembly himself. He stood in the main cargo bay in front of 800 people and told them everything. The biochemical models, the lattice, the threshold analysis, the cooperative framework, the orders from home that they were not going to follow. He was not inspirational about it. He was a commander presenting facts, and he told them exactly what the facts were and exactly what they required. He also told them about Marcus, about the second wave, about what this planet needed to be when those ships arrived. The vote was not close. 641 to 97 in favor of the cooperative framework. Karin's assembly, conducted by whatever distributed consensus process her people used, reached the same outcome within hours. The formal agreement took 3 more days to negotiate. The terms were simple in outline and complex in execution. 30% initial population transfer for both species. Geographic distribution designed by joint biochemical analysis. Full technology sharing. Simultaneous destruction of all orbital weapon systems, verified by both sides. Permanent prohibition on unilateral military development. Both sets of commanders were removed from authority. Voss included. He had insisted on it himself in the crew assembly, and Elias had watched the room go very quiet when he said it. They were relocated to orbital habitat modules. Comfortable, well-supplied, isolated from control systems. Not prisoners in any cruel sense. Simply no longer in charge. The weapons destruction took 6 hours. Elias watched from the observation deck as extraordinary machines turned themselves into clouds of engineered debris that would spiral into the upper atmosphere and burn on entry. He expected to feel something complicated. He felt instead profoundly light. The first colonization transports launched 48 hours later. Elias was in the second wave, and he stood in the transport bay thinking about the promise he'd made, to find his daughter a new home. He was going to send the message that there was a home, that it was real, that it required more patience than anyone had planned for. The signal would take 6 months to reach her. She would be almost 16 when she received it. The descent through the atmosphere was 40 minutes of turbulence and heat, and then the clouds parted and there it was. The surface, close enough now to make out individual trees in shades of green and amber, and a color he had no name for yet, some wavelength neighbor of gold. The transport set down in a wide valley between 2 low mountain ranges, and when the ramp lowered and the air hit him, He stood for a full minute just breathing. It tasted like rain and iron and something faintly sweet from the photosynthetic compounds the native flora exhaled in the afternoon light. Kareen's landing zone was 12 kilometers to the east. The biomonitoring stations they established at the boundary between settlements started producing data within the first 48 hours, and the data was quietly extraordinary. The atmospheric chemistry at the interface, in the valley running between their two settlements, was measurably more stable than at either settlement's interior. The carbon cycles had already begun finding the equilibrium the models had predicted. It wasn't theoretical anymore. It was happening right now in real time in the soil and the air between them. Elias had started calling it the interface privately, in his head. When Kareen came to him on the 9th day, taller than he'd expected, her surface refracting the afternoon light in patterns that shifted with her breathing, moving with the unhurried precision of something adapted to deep pressure and long time, the first thing she said, through the translation disk their technology teams had spent 5 days building together, was, "The valley between our settlements. I would like to name it in both languages." "I've been calling it the interface," he said. She processed this. "In my language, the closest concept would translate as the place where different things make each other stronger." "That's better," he said. "We should use that." They stood together looking at the valley. The afternoon light came from 2 directions at once. The primary star angled through the cloud layer in 2 different color temperatures, warm from the west and cool from the east, and the line where they met ran straight down the center of the valley like a seam in the fabric of the afternoon. Then the ground hummed. A low resonance felt more in the chest than through the feet. 10 seconds, then gone. Elias looked at Kareen. She was already looking at him. They ran. The geological monitoring station at the valley's eastern edge was already showing the readings when they arrived. A spike in lattice activity centered 2 kilometers below their feet, propagating outward in the hexagonal pattern, stronger than anything previously recorded, moving with unmistakable directionality. Moving toward the surface. It reached them 4 minutes later. A section of ground 3 meters in diameter opened. Not violently but precisely, the soil drawing back in ordered concentric rings to reveal the lattice below. And rising from it, slow and deliberate as a breath, a column of crystalline mineral, perfectly transparent, arranged in a helix that caught the divided afternoon light and fractured it into frequencies. The helix reached 2 meters and stopped. Its apex reorganized itself into a flat horizontal surface, a display, working on some principle neither of them could immediately identify, rendering information simultaneously in visual, electromagnetic, acoustic, and textural form. Simultaneously, in mathematical notation and in something that parsed, through their translation devices, as language. There were records here of others. Of every species that had ever arrived at planets like this one. Those who had chosen war. Brief records, ending in the thermal cascade signature. Those who had chosen cooperation. Long records, branching records. Civilizations that had grown from this kind of beginning into things Elias lacked the cognitive framework to fully process. They had gone on, these cooperating civilizations. They had built things together on the boundary between their different biologies. They had eventually seeded other planets, other systems, carrying the same principle forward. At the center of the display, in notation that both their translation systems rendered with perfect agreement, as if it had been written specifically for exactly the kind of unlikely pair standing in front of it, a sentence. Elias read it twice, then again. He looked at Kareen and she was looking at the same words, and the words required no interpretation in any language for any species that had come far enough to be standing here. Survival was never about strength, it was always about who chooses not to destroy. The crystal helix rotated in the divided light. Around them, the valley, the place where different things make each other stronger, lay open and patient, as it had been patient for longer than either of their species had existed. Above them, in his orbital habitat, Voss was watching through a porthole window as the northern continent bloomed with something his sensors identified as accelerated vegetation growth, 4 times the baseline, spreading from the valley outward, green and impossible and real. In the Southern Ocean, the temperature regulators had stabilized within normal variance. The atmospheric chemistry indicators were green across every monitoring band. The planet, it seemed, had been waiting a long time for someone to pass its test. And somewhere in the lattice below their feet, 40 meters down, something that might have been very old and very patient made a sound that Elias felt more than heard. A low harmonic, like the deep string of an instrument larger than anything human hands had ever built, resonating once through the rock and the soil and the roots of the new planted settlement. Kyrene's translation disc rendered it imperfectly as something close to Mother Good. Elias looked at her. She was looking at the sky, at the aurora that was still faintly visible even in daylight, the hexagonal clouds dissolving now, the planet releasing its geometric warning back into weather and wind, and the ordinary strangeness of an afternoon on a world that was not yet named. The civilization that built this, she said. Where did they go? Elias looked at the records still cycling through the crystal display. Histories so long and complex they would take years to process properly. I don't know, he said. Maybe somewhere beyond what we can currently map. Maybe they became something we don't have a category for. He paused. Maybe they're still watching. Kyrene was quiet for a moment. The light shifted. The seam down the center of the valley faded as the two color temperatures blended into something unified and amber. Then I hope, she said, we are worth watching. Elias thought about his daughter reading his message 6 months from now in a world that had 18 months left. He thought about her having to hold both things at once, the ending of one home and the beginning of another. He thought about Voss putting the key down, about 641 people choosing the harder thing, about the word Kyrene used for this valley, the concept her language had that his didn't quite have yet. The place where different things make each other stronger. Yeah, he said, I think we might be. The helix held its light. The valley settled into its first evening, both settlements' campfires visible on either side of the natural boundary they had already decided, without formal agreement, to leave unclaimed, a corridor of unbuilt space running between them like the space between two hands not quite touching, but close enough to feel the warmth. Somewhere in the rock below, the lattice hummed. It was, Elias had decided, the sound of something very old and very patient deciding that this, finally, was exactly what it had been waiting for.
So, that's the end of this story, but there are plenty of other great ones right here. Before you go, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring that little bell.